Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I see there's still a few people, looks like, trickling in, but I think we've reached a quorum at least to get ourselves started. So I'm Tim Erlin. I'm the VP of Product at WallArm, and I'm thrilled to be here. And Andrew, I'm going to let you introduce yourself as our guest for the day.
Absolutely. Good mornings, good afternoons. My name is Andrew Waithaka, Staff Solutions Engineer with Kong. And just a little bit about Kong. So Kong is a leader in the API management space, where we provide solutions that help organizations build, run, and govern the API portfolio. So these solutions include a platform to manage the full API lifecycle, as well as things like performance control, caching, versioning, etc. Glad to be here.
And we're really happy to have Andrew here. Kong and WallArm work well together, which we'll talk about a little bit. But the main purpose of this webinar is really to talk about this concept of your API security toolbox and what's in that toolbox, maybe what's in the toolbox and maybe what you want to have in that toolbox. So we'll aim for that topic and cover a little bit about WallArm and Kong along the way as well. So a couple of housekeeping items. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. It's also being broadcast on both LinkedIn and on Zoom. So you may be on LinkedIn, you may be on Zoom. We're looking at comments in both places. So if you have questions or you have comments during the presentation, feel free to add them to the Zoom Q&A or to add them to a comment in LinkedIn, and we'll do our best to get to those and respond to them either as they come in or at the end, depending on the timing. And if you'd like a recording of the presentation, it'll always be available on LinkedIn, and you can certainly request it from us in the comments as well. So with that, I'll get started. I want to start by putting up this particular figure here. So this 70% of application attacks now target APIs. And I want to explain where this figure comes from. So one of the things that WallArm does is this API threat stats report. We do analysis of all of the API vulnerabilities and attacks that are published. We do it on a quarterly basis. And then we do an annual roll-up of that data. And this figure is actually from our 2024 roll-up. So 2023 data published early 2024, where we measure the percentage of attacks that we see in the WallArm platform that target APIs versus targeting web applications. So 70% of all those attacks that we see coming across our platform are targeting APIs as opposed to web applications. Why is that important? Well, it demonstrates that the majority of attacks are now moving away from web applications towards APIs. APIs are the attack surface. And just to fill it in, the prior year, the 2022 data was 54%. And come January, when we publish the next set of annual roll-up data, we'll see what this figure looks like for 2024 as well. But we expect it to stay the same or grow as APIs have grown as well. So definitely seeing that attackers are, essentially following the market and moving towards targeting APIs instead of web applications. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about why APIs are such a popular attack target. And I've got this first bullet point here that the use of APIs is growing rapidly. I think that's easy to say. It's anecdotally true. One of the things that I think Andrew can add, and I'd like to ask you, Andrew, to add your thoughts here is, what do you see from the Kong perspective in terms of API usage? WallArm's obviously very security focused, but Kong has a slightly different focus. So what's your perspective there?
Yeah, great question. So I think what we're seeing across a lot of the organizations we work with is this drive by a lot of organizations to drive innovation or disrupt their industries through APIs, right? So they might go through the process of productizing these APIs, which then they make accessible to third-party developers who can subscribe to and perhaps pay to consume these APIs. So as the APIs become revenue generating and their value increases, they become right targets for attackers. So this, yeah, that definitely backs what we're seeing out of the field as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect to keep in mind is that it's not just that APIs are a popular technology. It's that they're attached to revenue, that they're a growth engine for customers. And so when you talk about or think about API security, it's connected to the business. And I think your observations from sort of what you see in the field with Kong, they match up with the next bullet point, which is that API requests now make up something like 80% of web traffic. I've seen a couple of different figures here depending on who's reporting them. They vary between 70 and 80% more or less. But I just want to highlight that because it's almost mind-blowing to me that 80% of the web traffic that's out there is made up of API requests. When you connect to a web application or a web page, behind that web page is a set of APIs and API requests that sort of are spawned out of your one connection. And that's what's making up the vast majority of the web traffic that's out there now. Um, and it's important to understand that APIs inherently expose more data as well. So APIs are designed to surface data. They're designed for programmatic interaction and to provide that data. That's a key component in what an API is. And so those top three items here alone can make APIs a more popular target or a popular target for attackers. But there's a little bit more that makes them popular as well. So we also see there's lower adoption of dedicated API security tooling. So there are lots of security tools out there. They aren't by and large focused on protecting APIs. Traditional AppSec tools or application security tools, they're built for originally for a world of web applications. And as a consequence, they tend to be ineffective at targeting or working with APIs. And generally speaking, despite the huge growth in API usage, there's less awareness of best practices. So when you combine that growth in usage and the slower adoption of best practices and security tools, if you're an attacker, that looks like a very attractive target. You've got high value data, you've got lots of attack surface, and you've got less protection than you might have in other areas as well. Now, not every organization is the same in terms of how they're using APIs. So I think, Andrew, one of the things that you do at Kong is you work with companies that are using APIs in a variety of different ways. Do these criteria match up with what you see as a more mature API environment? Is this what you would expect in an API in an organization that has a more mature approach to using and consuming APIs?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of tying back to what I mentioned before, this initiative by a lot of organizations to earmark the APIs as strategic assets,
Mhm.
it eventually ends up leading to this. Once the organization pivots in that direction, there's a lot more resources dedicated to making that API visible, consumable, successful out there, which in turn leads to higher call volumes, greater business value, etc.
Yeah, and maybe this list should be reversed, that it's the business value being attached to the API that drives those higher call volumes. Gets used
Absolutely.
more and
Yes.
drives the expansion. Yeah.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. And so, those mature organizations are going to look a bit like this. Now, if you flip the perspective, like this looks great. You're invested in APIs, you've got greater business value coming out of them that's driving their usage and their development and complexity. But if you're an attacker, these these attributes have a different view. From the attacker's perspective, that complexity and growth in APIs leads to more mistakes to exploit. There's no doubt that increased complexity, leads to configuration issues, to APIs that people might not know about. Those kinds of things are a boon for attackers. Higher call volumes, interestingly, makes it easier to evade detection. The more noise there is, the harder it is to monitor and identify those anomalies, those attacks. So from an attacker's perspective, high call volumes make it a more attractive target. And of course, the greater business value is the key, right? Attackers are looking for something worth stealing, worth compromising. And so if you're a mature organization and you've attached your APIs to your business, you're going to be a bigger target for those attackers, of course. So, I mean, that's kind of the introduction of why we're here, why we're talking about API security, why this concept of your API security toolbox is important. But ultimately, talking about the threat is one thing. It's important for us to talk about what you should do about those API threats. So let's take a look at that space and then dive into the toolbox itself. Now, I want to give a bit of an introduction to this slide. There's a fair amount of text on here, and we're going to look at it now, and then we're going to come back to it again. So there's a whole separate webinar we did about the API security maturity model. And at Wallarm, what we did here is we looked at the market and we said, well, customers, when they come to us, they're not always sure what it is they should be doing around API security. And there are best practices that have been published. You've got best practices from analysts like Gartner and Forrester. You've got best practices from vendors like Wallarm and Kong. You've got the OWASP API top 10, which is a kind of best practice if you look at it that way. And so what we actually did to produce this maturity model is we started by creating a complete list of all those best practices recommendations, and then categorizing them and subcategorizing them and breaking them down into the most complete set of best practices. And then as we did that, the conclusion we came to is that if any organization tried to implement all of those best practices at once, it would be impossible. They'd ultimately fail. And it made sense at that point to break down the best practices into a maturity model and say, okay, well, you've got different best practices that apply at different stages of your growth in terms of API maturity. And that actually naturally broke down into two main categories. So at the less mature end, when you're getting started with APIs or you're just starting to grow into APIs as a component of your business, we found that the security best practices are going to be more developer driven. As the organization matures and those APIs become a more critical part of the business, the security team is either going to, if it's the organization growing, the security team is going to appear at some point. Or if it's just the API component growing within that business, the security team is going to start paying attention to those APIs as part of a critical part of the business. And that's when that shift occurs from developer driven to security driven API security. So if we look at this model, in that first spot, when you're starting to develop APIs, if that's where you are, secure design really is the key component. Focusing on how do you build APIs that are secure from the start. It's a good place to start looking at API discovery as an initial capability. It might be more accurate to call that API inventory, right? Just making sure you know what APIs you've built and deployed in your environment. As you grow in maturity, then you can start looking at some additional secure design capabilities. Um, you can look at protecting yourself more from attacks that you're going to see in the environment. When you have public APIs, you will see these attacks. You'll see denial of service attacks. You'll see things like injection attacks, server-side request forgery. They will happen. And so protecting yourselves from those is important. This is also a good place to start looking at up-leveling your API discovery to an automated tool, finding differences in the environment. And then as you mature beyond that, you make that shift from having developer-driven to security-driven security, API security, where you can mature your API discovery even more. You can mature your threat protection to more sophisticated threats that might be relevant to your environment, things like account takeover, API-specific tools. You can also mature your bot protection from straightforward denial of service to more sophisticated API abuse. And then at the highest level, that high security piece, then you can really look at the complex business logic flaws, the more sophisticated attacks that are designed to circumvent your protections, and building in security testing as a continuous process falls into that space as well. So that's the idea of the maturity model and the background for it. And as I said, we'll come back to that and talk about it in greater detail. So
So Tim,
yeah, please go
I have
ahead,
a
Andrew.
quick question for you. Yeah. So looking at the security model, I think this is kind of the second time I've seen it. Is this, would you advise customers, is the goal of the customer to move to left to right as they mature, or
Hmm.
how does it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So often when people look at a maturity model, they see it as an intentional progression. The idea is that you should
Right.
actively work to move up that maturity model. I don't think
Yeah.
that's actually accurate. The goal here and the goal when I talk about maturity models is to use it as a tool for alignment. So you want to use that maturity model to understand where your organization is, not where your organization should be. That's up to the business to determine, right? Your business goals should determine where your organization wants to be. But identify where your organization is in terms of maturity and then align the controls that you're applying based on that position in the model. So the goal here is actually to do less work, if you think about it that way. Because you can't, as I said at the start, you can't implement all of the controls at once. You have to prioritize. And one way to prioritize is based on the controls that are the best fit for where your organization is in terms of maturity. Does that make sense, Andrew?
Absolutely. It does. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool, great. So let's dive into the toolbox itself. We're going to talk about three types of tools in the toolbox, and what they're good at, and what they maybe aren't so good at, because no tool is a silver bullet. That's the reality, right? And I want to start by talking about web application firewalls. Um, Web application firewalls, WAFs, they've been around for a long time, right? This is a tool that most organizations have at this point in one form or another. And they're solutions that are ultimately designed to protect web applications. So they grew out of the need to protect all of those web applications that organizations were building and deploying. And they do so by generally sitting in line with traffic, inspecting that traffic, monitoring it, filtering, and blocking malicious web traffic that's targeted at that web application. And generally speaking, architecturally, they fit uh, you know, between the internet and the web application. That's kind of the architectural logical position that they fit in. And Andrew, you've seen web applications around for a long time. Anything that I missed in that definition, or anything you'd want to add to it?
No, I think you captured it. I think that a really interesting point, and I think you kind of touched on it before, is why why do you think that there's still this idea that you could protect your APIs using web applications? Because that is something that I run into a lot, where there is this that I could still. Why do I need to get a pure play API security tool? Why do I need to do my authentication through an API gateway when I've got a WAF? Why do you think that
Yeah.
still exists as a question?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's not based on the capabilities, because we'll talk about what those capabilities are. But I
Mhm.
think it's based on the idea that this is the thing that sits between my application and the internet and the attackers and the threat, if you will. And there's this transition that's occurred or is occurring where, the web applications are becoming increasingly API driven. And so the web application component itself becomes thinner and thinner, but it's still the face, right? The thing that people interact with is still that web front end. And so I think there's a tendency to believe that the thing that has traditionally protected the web application is going to also protect those APIs. Um, but it's not necessarily a good fit.
Yeah, makes
Um,
sense.
but that's not to say that web application firewalls are bad or shouldn't exist, because they do provide a layer of protection and they are good at some things. So we've got a list here of what web applications are typically good at. And I think there's a little bit of a sidebar here about OWASP, right? Because if you're not familiar, um, OWASP is a nonprofit organization that quite a while back started publishing their top 10 threats. And it was the Open Web Application Security Program, right? So it was focused on web application security to start with. The original OWASP top 10 were web application threats, and they still publish those threats. Things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery. Those are threats against web applications. And web application firewalls do a good job of protecting against those attacks targeting web applications, no doubt. They also, because of their position in the network, tend to be good at just inspecting and filtering HTTP and HTTPS traffic, right? Web traffic at a high level, they're in a good position to provide a filter between the whole world and your environment at that application level. Along with that, web application firewalls tend to provide the services for distributed denial of service mitigation. Now, this is interesting because as more and more people move to cloud service providers, those cloud service providers are providing that DDoS protection, not necessarily separately or connected to the web application firewall that they also might provide. But so DDoS can be separated from WAFs, but it is something that traditionally WAFs have done fairly well. And then WAFs also have this role of providing virtual patches. It's not exclusive to the WAF, but deploying a specific rule that blocks a specific type of attack or a specific vulnerability from being exploited would be called a virtual patch. And then the last one here, I've got bot management, but I put a couple of asterisks on it because bot management is something that you often get from a web application firewall company, but it's often as a separate product or a separately licensed module. So it's not really fair to say WAFs are good at bot management, but it's also not really fair to say that they're not, because they tend to be the same infrastructure. Uh, but it's interesting to denote the difference between the traditional bots that target web applications, bots that are designed to mimic a human being interacting with that web application, and bots that are targeting APIs, which are specifically not designed to mimic a human being, because human beings aren't the ones that interact with APIs, right? So, Andrew, when you talk to customers at all, does bot management, do API bots or API abuse, does that ever come up on the Kong side of things?
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge topic, but kind of like around preventing abuse of APIs, and
Hmm.
we do have solutions around that. From an API gateway perspective, but kind of from a security perspective, we also do realize that there are pure play vendors that actually do that as
Sure.
a better job. But yes, it definitely is a conversation piece
Yeah.
that comes up, and we do have
Yeah.
a solution.
It's a real customer problem. I think trying
Correct.
to remember the exact phrasing, but one of our folks inside of WallArm said there are two types of customers: those who have a problem with API bots and those who don't know they have a problem with API bots.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what WAFs are not so good at, because no, as I said, no product is a silver bullet. So the web application firewalls tend to lack API specific protection. They're designed originally to examine and parse HTML or HTTP traffic, but they don't necessarily have the capability to drill into and decode or parse API specific protocols. Um, they're so they miss attacks is really the short way to put that, that are API specific. They also don't tend to do well with API abuse protection. So you may have WAFs that can block simple bots. You may have a bot management tool that can block sophisticated bots that are trying to emulate a human being. Bot management for web applications, its core mission is to separate bots from people and let the people through and block the bots. But with APIs, they're all automated, they're all programmatic, and so they don't do so well with things that exploit application logic or credential stuffing attacks or scraping attacks that are targeting APIs specifically. WAFs also aren't built for modern architecture, microservices architecture. They tend to be deployed at the perimeter, and a microservices architecture tends to be distributed internally in ways that the WAF may or may not be able to understand. So that tends to be a way that they don't service APIs as effectively as well.
And
Andrew,
Tim,
anything?
quick.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to actually, that is an interesting. So when you said they're deployed at the perimeter and there is this inflexibility about moving them around as, to mimic the distributed nature of microservices, what does that do if you were to decide to persist on using the WAF to protect your APIs and it's at the perimeter, but you've got this back-end distributed microservices architecture? What
Sure.
type of concerns are you dealing with from, say, a performance perspective in that case?
Yeah, there are two concerns that come to mind immediately. The first is that if you're trying to understand what APIs you have, just the problem of API discovery, which many customers start with us, they start with, I don't know what APIs I have. If you have a tool that's deployed at the perimeter, it's not going to see all of the internal APIs that are being used by those applications. So you're going to have an incomplete inventory, and that makes it very hard to protect those APIs. Secondly, you're going to miss attacks that aren't targeting that external web application. And as we talked about, that external web application is getting thinner and thinner. It's more driven by APIs in the back end. You want to protect those APIs. Attackers are finding ways to essentially embed API attacks through the web application or go to those APIs directly if they're directly accessible. And so you're going to miss attacks is what it comes down to. Those are the two key components that jump to mind for me. Yeah. Yeah. Did you have something in mind that I missed?
No, I was just kind of thinking. So, from an API gateway perspective, when we talk about the architectural differences between, say, some of the older security apparatus versus some of the newer security tooling, one of the things that we talk about is that the security tool needs to have cloud native elements, right? And
Yes.
that allows you to deploy that tool in a flexible fashion that mimics the microservices architecture that you have. For example, you may want to deploy your security tool right next to the microservices
Yeah.
for to reduce, for example, latency, right? So if my security tool is right next to my microservice, then it doesn't have to traverse from the edge all the
Mm.
way back in. So there are performance concerns like that we talk about, at least in my world. I was kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
curious if that is something that you talk about as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because for us, security comes first and performance comes second.
Yeah,
So we definitely talk about performance because it's a problem or a potential problem that customers worry about. Anytime you're adding a hop or adding an inline device, you're going to see some performance implication. So how can you deploy for the absolute minimum impact on performance? And you're absolutely right. Those deployment options where you're as close to the thing you're protecting as possible, or as close to that API as possible. That
right.
definitely comes up for us as a key component in terms of deployment. Yeah, cool. So those are web application firewalls. Let's move on and talk a little bit about what Andrew, you're really the expert on here today, which are API gateways. So will you start by just giving us that introduction to what is an API gateway?
Yeah, definitely. So API gateways, I'd like to say they facilitate centralized management and governance of your API. So, and this in turn allows us to enforce consistent policies to APIs. So, think about it from a perspective that you have all these APIs, and there are two ways that you're going to provide access to those APIs. One way could be I like to think of it as naked access, which means that the API is exposed and it's an endpoint that is readily available, or you have that API behind an API gateway, which then allows you to kind of have centralized management and governance around that API. So the API gateway pattern is what is the recommended way for exposing your APIs is through an API gateway. And then through that exposure, beyond the exposure, you're then able to implement centralized management and governance. Now, and I should also add, kind of this is an important thing, in a consistent way. One thing that I think also a lot of people don't kind of realize is that from an API endpoint perspective, you end up having way more exposed endpoints when compared to, say, when we're talking about, say, from the old world where you're protecting web applications. From an API perspective, you end up having way more endpoints exposed. And if you don't have a centralized way of managing those, then you're not able to enforce consistent policies to those APIs. So that's kind of the goal around using API gateways, is to be able to enforce consistent policies to your APIs. Now, from a
So
comm
can you,
perspective, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, give me a couple of examples of what a consistent policy would be, or what the benefit to the organization is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, being able for security team to say that all our APIs are, maybe using token-based authentication, which could be, OAuth or OpenID Connect or some, JWT or even API keys, right? But being able to go to one central place and enforce policy and make sure that any API that goes into production is actually meeting the standards. And you're able to do that because now everything is centrally managed through the API gateway.
So would encryption be another example, like just making sure that every API you publish is encrypted?
Absolutely, yes. So some customers want, that front end encryption. Some customers also want to be able to do mutual TLS between the API and its back end implementation. So also being able to enforce that at the gateway makes that a much more convenient and easier
Hmm.
place to do than trying to
So
independently do that across all APIs.
yeah, it's not just enforcing policy for the external users of the API, but it's also enforcing consistency and governance for the connection between the gateway and the APIs as a whole, the internal piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
interesting. And
Yeah.
you previously mentioned performance. Are there specific performance benefits or targets that customers worry about with the API gateway as well?
Yeah, so a lot of APIs that a lot of customers that I work with, their APIs are customer facing, and those customers have an expectation for a certain experience. And so being able to have a performant gateway that is able to meet those demands is actually a very, very important thing. Being able to be as close to your API as possible to minimize the latency it takes from the time the gateway receives the requests, applies its policy, and then sends a request to the upstream, etc. Those are all the important things. So performance in my world is a huge, huge thing.
Yeah, yeah. So we've jumped ahead a little bit here, maybe to the what API gateways are good at, what they really, ultimately what problems do they solve for customers? Are there other items here that we haven't talked about that you want to cover that are important?
Yeah, I kind of just want to touch a little bit on, so, from a Kong perspective, so how does Kong actually implement this, right? So Kong has an extensible architecture which provides hundreds of plugins, and these plugins are then used to apply different policies. So, on the screen here, we've talked about kind of the different, policies that you could apply, again, which would be applied to plugins. If you're trying to do centralized API traffic management, which could include how am I routing my requests to the backend streams, to the backend
Hmm.
upstream services? If I want to do protocol translation, if I want to do caching and performance optimization, etc. All those are applied through plugins. Now, when we start talking about security, you can also do your authentication and authorization. So we talked about maybe the organization may want to enforce token-based authentication, so enforce security protocols like OAuth, JWT, etc. All that would be again managed through security policies. Now,
Hmm.
as from a Kong perspective, we're also aware that we're not a security company in that perspective, and so that is why we partner with pure play best of breed partners like Wallem, because there are concerns like across many organizations that we work with. There's most teams are not aware or fully aware of all the APIs that run in them. So the question is, how do we go about discovering these APIs? And even beyond discovering them, how can we run an assessment against that API to ensure that it is not vulnerable? This is not a space that API gateways play in, right? Or attack detection and blocking. This is real-time attack detection and blocking. So you've got an API that is exposed and servicing customers. How do we detect whether that API is under attack? Again, while the API gateway is exposing that API for consumption, these are capabilities that are not typically built into the gateway. And from a Kong perspective, we partner with partners like Wallem to be able to offer this to our customers as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the API discovery piece is an interesting one because, of course, in order to manage your APIs with an API gateway, you have to first know that they exist. It's
Correct.
very hard to manage them if you don't know they exist. So that API discovery piece is a starting point for both WallArm in terms of understanding what needs to be protected and for Kong in terms of understanding what needs to be managed.
Absolutely. I have a quick question for you now, and I'm always kind of curious. Why do you think, or how do you think organizations get to a point where they don't know how many APIs they have? What is it that makes APIs that unique? Because when they were protecting web servers, it's not like there ever was an instance where the web servers were exposed. I mean, there might be, but not as prevalent as APIs are. What do you think is the difference that causes that?
Hmm. The interesting thing to me there is that, so first of all, when we talk about APIs, um, there's an implicit assumption that we're talking about APIs that the organization has built and deployed themselves. But the reality is that APIs go well beyond that. More and more often when you purchase commercial off-the-shelf software, it's coming with an API of some kind that is exposed inside your environment. If you're sharing with partners in some way, it might be exposed outside of your environment. And so part of that explosion of APIs is that they're being used not just for me to deliver a service to my customers like a web application, but also for me to integrate my internal tools, for me to integrate internal data and tools with those applications that I'm exposing externally, and also to integrate with partners. So it's kind of an exponential explosion based on the speed at which I think you mentioned at the beginning, the speed
Mhm.
at which innovation is being driven. So those APIs aren't just the ones that I'm producing and delivering to customers. That web application pipeline was in many ways fairly straightforward. And the pipeline of APIs to support whatever's being exposed externally is less straightforward.
Yeah,
Um, and also architecturally, when you add a new function to an API, you add a new endpoint.
right.
Architecturally speaking, they just tend to proliferate in ways that are different than a web application. for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good. So let's jump ahead to talk about API protection tools, which we've touched on a little bit. But what we're really talking about here are this category of tools that are specialized security solutions intentionally designed to protect APIs from attacks. The topics here are threats and vulnerabilities, specifically targeting APIs. And so it's a combination of features that are designed for that API protection. The things that these tools tend to be good at. Uh, Interestingly, API discovery and posture assessment has become a table stakes requirement for API protection tools. These are the tools that generally people are looking to understand what APIs are present in their environment, to discover what APIs are exposed externally, and also to do an initial risk assessment for those APIs. So looking at how they're structured, what data they surface, do they surface sensitive data? Are they vulnerable to specific types of attacks? That's the posture assessment side of it. And then, of course, that attack detection and prevention is a key component. So API protection tools should detect and block attacks. It's a simple thing to say. It's a complex thing to implement. Attackers continue to innovate how they try to innovate how they create attacks to get around security controls. It's the job of these API protection tools like WallArm to keep up with those attackers. And I think it's wise to divide attacks into sort of two broad categories. There are the stateless attacks that you can detect in a single request. So that's something like a SQL injection or a path traversal, right? Somewhere in that request, maybe it's buried, maybe it's encoded, maybe it's in a header, maybe it's in the body, but somewhere in that request is an attack, and that request by itself constitutes an attack. So those would be the stateless attacks. There are also the stateful attacks, which are really where we're seeing more sophisticated attackers today. Those are attacks that require a session behavior over a session in order to execute. And that includes things like account takeover, scraping, so pulling mass amounts of data, one request at a time, maybe, or maybe batched, but that kind of scraping of data would fall into API abuse prevention. More attacks that target the business logic of an application itself would fall into that API abuse category. And that's where there's overlap with the bot management capabilities because API bots are different from web app bots, and so API abuse prevention is in many ways a separate capability. Um, API protection tools also do rate limiting. There's overlap here with the API gateways. You can use both, but they may be applied in different ways or in response to different types of events. For API protection, rate limiting in many ways is a mitigation control that you can use as a response to an attack. And then also detecting sensitive data and API leaks is another component of API protection. So identifying when you have data that's exposed outside of your organization. But these API protection tools, there are things that they're not good at, right? They are ultimately security tools. So all of those things that you were talking about, Andrew, for why you would want to use an API gateway, that centralized traffic management, standardizing and implementing authentication and authorization, the protocol translation, some of that caching and performance optimization. Those are not things that you would expect an API protection tool to do. And the one that I see the most confusion here in the market is around that authentication and authorization. So the API protection tools uh, can monitor traffic, look for attacks. They can tell you whether those attacks are using authentication, but we're not a tool that actually implements that authentication and authorization mechanism, whereas an API gateway does, right?
Right.
Perfect. So let's jump ahead back. Well, we'll jump back really to the API security maturity model and talk a little bit about where these tools might fit. So remember, we had this sort of just starting out. You're just building APIs and getting used to them. Is this a place where you would expect customers to implement any of these tools? Andrew, is this a place where you would see API gateways as useful?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about, like in the secure design here, you talk about authentication, authorization, etc. All those capabilities would be capabilities that would be supported by an API gateway. So absolutely, I definitely do see one here.
Yeah. So when you're doing that secure design piece, looking at what you're going to implement, it's a good place to start standardizing, and an API gateway can help you standardize there.
Correct.
If you're my perspective, if you're just starting out with APIs, well, there's certainly an opportunity to protect yourself from attacks. This is not where we tend to see people pick up and purchase and implement API protection tools because there isn't enough traffic there for it to be a significant concern. Most customers will have a WAF at this point. Generally, they might get it as a checkbox feature from their cloud service provider, and that WAF can provide some protection at a starting point. But as you mature, when we move up to that growing number of APIs, this is where we see customers really implementing uh, API protection tools because now you've got the need to protect yourself from those specific attacks, right? That threat protection piece at the bottom. Uh, in our analysis of the traffic that we see, injection attacks are at the top, right? So SQL injection being the most common, and that's just a reality of putting a service on the internet. You're going to see people attempting to run these types of attacks against your APIs, and you need to protect yourself from them. So it's definitely a place where we see API protection being useful. As you move up this maturity model, Andrew, are there capabilities from Kong that become more relevant as you get more mature?
I would say the one that a lot of organizations are always looking to implement, um, as relates to the conversation we're having today, is always around authentication and authorization, especially you know just token-based authentication authorization and being able to not only authenticate a user but also determine through authorization, through claims and scopes, what is that user able to access, right? Those, from a security perspective, those are areas that we spent a lot of time around. And obviously, the encryption, MTLS, etc. Those are all
Sure.
obviously table stakes as well.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. This is also where API discovery should start to become automated. And so there's room for API protection tools to start creating that inventory for you as well. And then obviously at this more mature level, this is where I think, all the tools in the toolbox become particularly relevant. You've got, greater need for standardization as you have more APIs. I think that plays into the need for API gateways there, and also more complex attacks to protect from. And Also, at this point, we see more customers who have, uh, you know, good hygiene around API specification creation. And those specifications can be used to evaluate, to implement governance essentially. So are the endpoints in the environment, do they match to my specification or not? Do I have shadow APIs? Do I have rogue APIs? And maybe I want to enforce some of those specifications in my environment as well. If I have good hygiene around producing the specs, then I can potentially do enforcement around those specifications and implement more of a positive security model, letting through only the known good things versus a negative security model, blocking known bad things.
And also just to add, what we see as well, between the growing number, the second box and the third box,
Yeah,
is the automation and governance enforcement, and being able to do that through automation is a really big driver across a lot of our customers, which is to say that you start off with an open API spec, and how do you get that open API spec published to a gateway, and and a consumer consuming it, and with throughout that process, how do you ensure that the desired organizational policies are implemented in an automated way?
mm,
So a lot of our
yeah,
more mature organizations are really, really working hard towards that automation of governance and
yeah.
enforcement.
Yeah, that's interesting. That reminds me that part of the transition here between these two stages in the maturity model is that shift from developer driven to security driven. So in some cases, it's not necessarily that the tool is different, but that the audience for that data, the audience for that tool shifts as well.
Right.
Um, and that happens certainly for security. And then we've got that last high security API environment, which is sort of at the far end of that maturity model, where you really need to consider more complex, from our perspective, more complex attacks, more business logic flaws or business logic attacks, and really instrumenting your environment. I think at that point, if you haven't implemented a gateway strategy or API protection tools, I'd be surprised if you could get to that maturity level without having done so, of course.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, good. So just to sort of head towards wrapping up, again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat or in the Q&A in Zoom or the chat in LinkedIn. Just to head towards wrapping things up, both WallArm and Kong, one of the reasons that we make for good partners is our support of our open source components. There are numerous ways to get started with the tools, but WallArm offers an open source API firewall. This is the component that we use inside of WallArm to do traffic filtering. The open source piece is a standalone command line tool that you can use to do some of the same things, detecting and blocking attacks, enforcing API specifications, and GraphQL policies are supported in there as well. Andrew, how does the open source piece fit for Kong?
Yeah, so Kong is actually a lot of our users typically start using Kong from the open source side, and very very successful open source project. And as those organizations mature and they're looking for more capabilities, they will typically evolve to the enterprise side of Kong, where they then can start taking advantage of the platform features of the solution, which allows them to do a lot more things like, cataloging the APIs, etc.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. I think there's a similar pattern for WallArm as well. Moving up to some of the more, the API discovery features, the platform features.
Right.
And of course, Kong and WallArm do work together. The primary, aside from the complementary capabilities that we offer, the integration itself is between WallArm and the Kong gateway, so that WallArm can deploy connected to that gateway and collect traffic and block attacks through the Kong gateway, giving you seamless integration, seamless deployment. And I think we have a number of customers joint customers who get benefits from the deployment of both solutions.
Yeah, and if I could just add a little bit on that as well. So I talked a little bit before about Kong's pluggable architecture. So Wallem is a best of breed secure partner of ours. Their integration is able to work with Kong through the pluggable architecture. So as a plugin, Wallem is able to integrate into Kong. And in addition to the capabilities that the gateway is providing, around application and user authentication, etc., we can now add the API protection capabilities that Wallem brings to the table. But beyond that, now what ends up happening is that our customers now are able now to take advantage of the broader Kong portfolio. So for example, Wallem does the automated API discovery. Eventually, those APIs now can be protected by Kong, but over and above that, as part of the Connect platform, which is actually Kong is part of that Connect platform, those APIs now can begin to get added to other applications, such as the service catalog, which is something a lot of our customers typically use to centrally manage all APIs in an organization. So this integration really works well, and yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I'm going to put up this slide for our upcoming API Security Summit while we answer questions. The WallArm has been doing these summits, throughout the year in different locations. So this one happens to be in San Diego, and if you happen to be in San Diego, it's a great event to attend. We will have Kong there as a partner as well, and really quality content, I think. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them. I've got a couple of questions here. I'll start with this one for you, Andrew. It's what authentication protocols does Kong support for? I assume that's for implementing them as enforcing them in the APIs.
Yeah, correct. So you can do, like I talked about, token-based authentication. So you can do your OAuth, OpenID Connect. If you want to go that route, you can implement JWTs if you want to do that. API keys. There's a slew of authentication protocols that you can use, including MTLS as well. Again, the plugin hub is a great place. Just type, and you can search for Kong plugin hub, and that gives you a list of all the plugins and their capabilities. And you can filter by security and authentication if you wanted to actually discover more.
Cool. I've got another question here. How does WallArm detect credential stuffing? Okay, so I mentioned credential stuffing at some point as like a type of API abuse, and I think it's worth sort of explaining that credential stuffing is a type of attack. It can occur bunch of different ways, but ultimately it's about taking generally compromised credentials and attempting to authenticate with those credentials to some kind of a service. If those authentication attempts occur, you know, fast enough, then they get detected based on the pattern of those requests. But the tricky part is that, of course, if I'm an attacker, I don't want to be detected, so I'm going to do that sort of low and slow approach to credential stuffing, where I'm going to do fewer authentication attempts, space them out. WallArm actually has a database of known compromised credentials that we keep up to date. So we'll detect individual authentication attempts using a compromised credential, a known compromised credential. The benefit of that is that if an attacker is sort of low and slow attempting to use those credentials, we'll see them. Uh, the other benefit of that is that you have legitimate users who are authenticating with a compromised credential that they don't know is compromised. We'll identify those as well, and you can potentially prompt them to change that credential before it gets used as part of an account takeover attack or credential stuffing attack. So a couple of capabilities in there as well. And just looking at the questions, let's see. I see, I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a comment. There's a question here about does the Kong gateway have capabilities for LLM APIs or managing AI APIs?
Yes, great question. Yes, so we Kong, that's our AI gateway, which again is an extension of your existing Kong today. So if you have Kong today, for example, deployed in your environment and you're using it to perform perhaps your authentication and rate limiting, etc., you can extend functionality of Kong by using different AI plugins that we have that do all several capabilities. For example, if you wanted to load balance across multiple LLMs based on the prompt that the user sent. So maybe you've got multiple LLMs that serve different use cases, are trained on different data. You can use Kong to do that. If you want to, for example, cache responses so that you don't necessarily consume your tokens to your upstream provider, to your upstream LLM, you can also do that, which means that the Kong AI gateway is intelligent enough to discern that the prompts that were sent prior are similar to the prompt that I am sending. And therefore, instead of, say, sending the request back up to the LLM, that can be satisfied by the plugin itself. So lots of capabilities around the AI. And this is actually one of the fastest areas that Kong is investing in. And again, through the plugin hub, you can find details around all the capabilities relating to AI.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I've got another question here. It says, what I understand is that even with a WAF and an API gateway, it's still not sufficient to fully protect our APIs. Is that correct? Yes. So if we go back to the toolbox, the point here is that this combination of tools, WAFs, API gateways, and API protection, they have some overlapping capabilities, but lots of capabilities that are distinct. The WAFs are an older tool, good for protecting web applications, but not really for protecting APIs. Fundamentally, WAFs tend to miss attacks targeted at APIs. So the API protection tools fill in that gap and protect your APIs from attacks. And of course, the gateways are there to help manage and enforce, security policies like authentication, as we've been talking about, and also provide that centralized management. I've got one more question here. Can Kong or WallArm be integrated to a SIM, such as QRadar or Rapid7? I'll answer for WallArm, and Andrew can answer for Kong. WallArm, yes, absolutely. You can have the events from WallArm piped out to your SIM, no problem. It's a supported integration, and you can read about the list of specific SIMs or the open options at docs.wallarm.com, where our documentation is. Andrew, do you want to answer for Kong there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Kong provides numerous ways to integrate with your SIM, again, through plugins. We have custom plugins for some of the top SIM providers out there, as well as just your regular file log, HTTP log, which will basically just take all the request traffic or based on the criteria and send that to your SIM of choice. Absolutely.
Perfect. Fantastic. Okay. I don't see any additional questions coming in, but if you come up with a question after the fact, feel free to add it. We'll try and monitor the comments and answer questions as they come in if they didn't get in for the live session. But with that, I want to thank you, Andrew, for spending the time with us. I really appreciate it. I
No,
think
thank you.
it was a useful and interesting session for me, at least. I hope it was for all of the audience as well.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.